In this lecture, we'll be looking at Chapter 11, Gender, Race, and Modernism After the Second World War. Now, the ways that the meanings of modernist art have been produced, reinforced, and challenged can be observed in the shifting relationship of women's art to broader social formulations in mainstream art during this period. However, the origins of these shifts lie in the 1930s, the period when American artists began self-consciously to formulate a social role for visual arts. During the Depression, American artists under government patronage became an integral part of the workforce and evolved a socially conscious visual language. Working outside the dealer-critic museum system, male and female artists identified themselves with the labor force. Federal art projects supported women's struggles for professional recognition. A 1935 survey of professional and technical workers on relief, meaning government relief in the New Deal programs, revealed that among artists receiving aid, approximately 41% of them were women. The federal section of Fine Arts, which was a non-relief program, which funded murals for public buildings, awarded its commissions on the basis of anonymous competitions in which artists submitted unsigned sketches. Also, the WPA, Works Progress Administration, that patronage also extended to artists of color. However, despite achievements, women of color often face formidable political and social barriers. A significant group of American artists and writers of color who, at least since the 1920s, had sought to escape from racism and restricted professional and social opportunities by removing themselves to other countries. So basically, to find better opportunities, they left the United States. Also, what we'll then begin to see is a backlash against women wage earners during the 1930s, and this takes a devastating toll. On the cultural front, at the same time that women artists were participating in mural projects which explored the social realities of unemployment and life in the Depression, Hollywood was producing the first of a series of films popularly known as weepies. These were addressed to a female audience, and their female protagonists confronted issues or problems specified as female. Things such as domestic life, the family, maternity, self-sacrifice, and romance. In the next decade, some found themselves on less secure footing as governmental patronage gave way to private art galleries and as social ideologies promoted sexual difference as cause for removing women from productive labor. In the early 1940s, before the consolidation of abstract expressionism, artists in New York worked in styles ranging from social realism to geometric abstraction. But with the consolidation of abstract expressionism as the dominant practice in American modern art, this pushed to the margins not only women moving toward artistic maturity and other modern styles in the 1940s, but also many women professionally active in what would come to be seen as conservative and outmoded figurative styles. The painting of women whose careers developed within abstract expressionism are not representative of the wide range of work actually executed by women at this time, nor did these women make a unified group. And so here we're going to look at the artist Lee Krasner. Her dates 1908 to 1984. And her career during the 1940s and 50s points up the precarious place of the feminine within the rhetoric and institutions of abstract expressionism. She trained first at the Women's Art School of Cooper Union and at the National Academy of Design. After meeting the artist Jackson Pollock in 1941, she turned to automation. Now, this relationship with Pollock created a personal struggle to define herself as an artist different from Pollock, who she married in 1945. The critical language of abstract expressionism that developed alongside Pollock's drip paintings of the late 1940s isolated and celebrated certain features, notable among them scale, action, and energy, using terms that became part of an informing metaphoric of masculinity. The gendered language positioned women outside an emerging model of subjectivity understood in terms of male agency articulated through the figure of the male individual. Krasner was forced to confront the ways in which her own body was inscribed as feminine, and she refused to produce a self in her paintings. She attempted to establish a difference that could not be dismissed as the otherness of woman. To position herself independently of Pollock's forceful artistic personality, she had to separate herself from the construction of masculine subjectivity that was embedded in abstract expressionism. Also, the shift from government-sponsored, non-discriminatory art projects to the emerging world of the private dealer gallery critic also meant seeing her as Mrs. Pollock/wife overshadowed her as Lee Krasner/painter in New York's art world. She began to approach painting as a meditative exercise, seeking to obliterate figurative references and hierarchical compositions. The little image paintings that resulted oppose the mural-sized canvases that were later accepted as defining the ambition of the male abstract expressionists. She and other women abstract expressionists were well aware of the operations of sexual difference within artistic practice. During the 1940s and 50s, they confronted the widely held view that women could not paint. Now, the tensions between an ideology of sexual difference, one that assured jobs for returning servicemen, supported the shift of population to the suburbs, and provided meaningful work for women through homemaker, and vanguard art can be seen in painting and sculpture by men as well as women. Many women artists, encouraged by their teachers to divorce art practice from female experience and self-awareness in order to succeed professionally, found themselves painfully aware of the contradictions between artistic and personal identity. And here we're going to look at the artist Louise Bourgeois. Her dates 1911 to 2010. And then her femme maison paintings, meaning feminine, female house, were exhibited in 1947. And here you've got 3 different ones on the image. They pointed to the home as a place of conflict for the woman artist. However, critics read the paintings as affirming a natural identification between women and home, which is not what she was doing. She did train in Cubist abstraction, and under the influence of surrealism, she developed the personal quasi-figurative images of these femme maison paintings. Here, domesticity is imaged through blank facades and small windows, defining women but denying them speaking voices. By 1949, confined to the margins of a largely male discourse, women functioned as decorative accessories of bohemia, their presence often seen as conforming the heterosexuality and masculinity of their partners. Artists such as Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, and Grace Hardington were ambitious artists who received positive critical support during the early 1950s, and whose work was included in major abstract expressionist exhibits. Yet, all of them struggled, as did Lee Krasner, to define a difference from their painting of their male contemporaries that could not be reduced to the difference of women. So what they would often be, how their work would be looked at as woman and not considered with the male contemporaries. In fact, in 1949, Krasner and Pollock exhibited in Cindy Janis's group exhibition titled Man and Wife. The very title of this exhibition organized women's productions in a subsidiary, socially defined category. Krasner and Elaine de Kooning both chose to sign their works with their initials only, while Hartigan briefly adopted the sobriquet George. In each case, the decision to erase gender as part of the creative process was less an attempt to hide their identities as women than to evade being labeled feminine by becoming the man/woman whose creative efforts earned praise. Now, Helen Frankenthaler, her dates are 1928 to 2011, she's the only woman painter of the period who consistently dismissed gender as an issue. Constructing a special category for her work in which color and touch are read as feminine, they ceased examining it in relation to its specific historical context and instead linked it to an unchanging and essentialized tradition of women's work. Now, after Pollock's death in 1956, Krasner turned to large-scale, hybrid, anthropomorphic forms in a series of disturbing paintings. A period of intense creative activity followed, during which she fully developed a unique idiom. Deliberately choosing colors with feminine connotations, she used them in ways that negated their traditional associations. Now, the period from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s was important in bringing recognition to a number of women sculptors. And here we'll look at Louise Nevelson. Her date's 1900 to 1988. She worked with cast-off and recycled materials during the 1950s. She worked steadily for many years before receiving the recognition given her male contemporaries at a much earlier date. She, in fact, did not receive a solo museum exhibit in the United States until 1960. She studied painting in Munich during the 1930s and won her first sculpture competition at the ACA Galleries in New York in 1936. But the blatantly sexist critical response to her first major exhibition drove her from the gallery world for almost 10 years. In fact, one critic said, quote, "We learned the artist was a woman in time to check our enthusiasm. Had it been otherwise, we might have hailed these sculptural expressions as by surely a great figure among the modernists," unquote. So basically saying, once they found out she was a woman, they said, oh, well, then these can't be good works because they were done by a woman. In 1955, she began constructing entire walls out of crates, boxes, architectural fragments, pieces of pianos, stair railings, chair slats, and other urban bric-a-brac. She assembled them together after painting all the pieces a single color that gave them unified form and structure. These wall-sized constructions created new environments. And what's interesting, if you're in Louisville like I am, if you go ever see a work at the Kentucky Center of Performing Arts at downtown, there's actually Louise Nevelson work in the lobby. All right, by the end of the 1950s, many artists were turning away from the drama of abstract expressionism and denouncing symbolic, mythic, and subjective content as rhetorical devices. Younger artists cultivated detachment from the process of making images. The British op artist Bridget Riley, who was born in 1931, her uncompromising non-figurative work, which first attracted critical attention during the op art movement of the 1960s, addresses itself to the formal issues of painting, the nature of color in pictorial space, shape, and flatness, the relation of feeling to color and image, the historical traditions of painting. The relative lack of attention paid by mainstream galleries and critics to artists working in alternative ways helped perpetuate the fiction of the mainstream as monolithic and masculine, a world in which women functioned only as exceptions or in which they were forced to deny any identification with other women. Now, it is significant that among the women who received the greatest critical attention during the early 1960s, three sculptors whose work embodied highly subjective responses to the mainstream concerns were more successful, and we're going to see all three of them on this slide. First, we have Lee Bontaku, born 1931. Her work is the one on the left, and she studied sculpture at the Art Students League. She spent several years in Rome on a Fulbright fellowship, and her large, rugged constructions were fabricated from worn-out commercial laundry conveyor belts, which she sewed onto steel frames. First shown in 1950, they were compared to everything from airplane engines to female sexual parts. Second is the artist Marisol, whose dates are 1930 to 2016, and she was born in Paris to Venezuelan parents, and she lived in New York since 1950. Her work is the one in the middle here. Around 1954, she began putting little terracotta figures in boxes. And her representational images based on American figures were immediately linked to pop art. But her work, in fact, has sources in pre-Columbian art, early American folk carving, and surrealist dream images. Her obsessive use of self-images, when combined with stereotypical presentations of women living out circumscribed roles, built a chilling picture of American middle-class life in the 1960s. And then we get Niki de Saint-Phalle. Her date's 1930 to 2002. Here, she also offered images of women that ran counter to formulous aesthetics during the years when pop art gave us slick nudes, pinups, and sex objects. Her monstrous female figures were impossible to ignore, and you see one of her works here on the right. The early nanas, gaily painted and exaggerated figures are at once childlike and monstrous, archetypal and toy-like, and were constructed on chicken wire frames covered with fabric and yarn to create intricately textured surfaces. At the same time, they all refuse the mythic and romantic fantasies projected by men onto images of women. Her work, Hon, H-O-N, reclaimed a woman's body as a site of tactile pleasure rather than an object of voyeuristic viewing. Now, during the late 1960s and the early 1970s, challenges to the dominance of modernism began to take place on many, often overlapping fronts. After 1970, many women began to formulate specifically feminist works based on a commitment to radical social change that addressed the ways that women's experiences had been suppressed and or marginalized in Western culture. Areas in which the work of women artists would have a significant and lasting impact included the use of new materials and processes, the developments of collective and collaborative ways of working, performance and body art, minimalism, earthworks and public art, and feminist art. And what we mean by feminist art is art that self-consciously embodies an aspect of feminism's political agenda. Now, why this work is not necessarily or intrinsically feminine, it is historically feminine in its opposition to the reductive, totalizing, patriarchal aesthetics that had long characterized modernism. By the mid-1960s, a number of New York artists were incorporating non-art materials and new technologies into their works. The works of Bourgeois, Hess, Marisol, and Saint-Fils implied content that could not be accommodated by formalist aesthetics, or by reducing significance of gender to the sex of the artist or to her conscious intentions. By 1966, the cultural conflicts that divided a generation of Americans, such as racism, sexism, and militarism, invaded the art world. Until then, the art world had been secure in the belief that the aesthetic issues were unrelated to or transcended social concerns. Now, it's Black artists and women artists, both black and white, who first gave visual form to the growing gulf between the white American dream and the Black American reality. We have the artist Faith Ringgold, who's born 1930, and you see her work, Die, here on the left. She was an African-American artist who was raised in Harlem, and she investigated the connections between patriarchy, racism, and imperialism. She was influenced by the writings of James Baldwin and Amari Baraka. In 1966, she participated in the first exhibition of Black artists held in Harlem since the 1930s. And again, the image here is shown is her Die from 1967, and it's a 12-foot wide street mural of a street riot. We also have the artist Mae Stevens, 1924 to 2019. She was white and from New York, and she produced images in response to the current racial strife. She explored the relationship between patriarchal power in the family and in social institutions like the American judicial system. And then we have the artist Betty Saar. She was born 1926, and she's from California. And what she would do in her work is she began incorporating stereotypical images of Blacks into collages and constructions. Their content was both political and angry. And you see that in the work here on the right. This is The Liberation of Aunt Jemima from 1972. And this deals with white culture's stereotypical images of Blacks, including an Aunt Jemima holding a small revolver in one hand and a rifle in the other, all placed in a box that's papered with mammy pictures. Now, what we'll see is a series of events in late 1969 and early 1970 led to the first protests against racism and sexism in the American art world. And your textbook gives you some very specific examples. In the face of protests by blacks, students, and women, the fiction of an art world isolated from broader social and political issues by objectivity, quality, and aesthetics began to be exposed. And that's going to bring us to the women's movement. The feminist movement on the arts, which is the commitment to an art that reflects women's political and social consciousness, this profoundly influenced artistic practice in America during this period through its constant questioning of and challenge to patriarchal assumptions about ideologies of what is art and the artist. A renewed interest in art produced by women generally also spread to a number of artists from an earlier generation, many of whom had been professionally active since the 1930s. During the early 1970s, women artists of the previous generation responded to the new, more open climate in a variety of ways. Some continued to insist that issues of gender were irrelevant in making art, and others spoke out. Throughout the decade, women identified and defined a multiplicity of relationships to feminist and mainstream concerns. Throughout the decade, women continued to question existing definitions of form and materials. And you're going to see more experimentation with both. And again, the book's going to give you some very specific examples. By the early 1970s, a large group of women artists had formed in New York, focusing on explorations into materials, process, and time. At a historic moment when feminism was encouraging many women to explore issues of autobiography, narrative, and personal identity in their work, other women embarked on investigations motivated by their interest in history, archaeology, and anthropology. And here are the two images that are shown. On the left, you have Audrey Flack's Wheel of Fortune Vanitas from 1977 to 78, and Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels from 1973 to 76. We have the artist Jackie Windsor, who was born in 1941. And what she does in pieces made from plywood, pine, rope, twine, trees, lace, and nails also addressed issues of material and process. Some of her works, like 30-to-1 Bound Trees from 1971, which is shown here, recalls a hidden history of female productivity in areas like needlework, basketry, and quilt making. Her work made visible what has historically been a hidden process, the complexity and labor of women's traditional handicrafts. Also, many artists chose to put their works in landscape rather than in the gallery, and that'll take us back here to Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels on the right. Many of them began to use landscape forms and sites. In many cases, a desire to work in public developed in relation to an expanded view of social consciousness shaped by the social protest movements of the late 1960s. The group experiences of feminism and access to new sources of public funding in the arts was also important. The work of many women sculptors reveals a concern with issues of geological time, the perception and experience of landscape, and the Earth's annual cycles, which she deals with in Sun Tunnels. During the same period, a number of young women painters, not necessarily feminist, made significant contributions to the elaboration of mark and shape as expressive pictorial devices. They combine research, discovery, and analysis in their approach to the formal issues of painting, and their work refuses easy categorization. And here's one of the examples from the textbook. This is Jennifer Bartlett's Rhapsody from 1975 to 76, and this is just a detail of it. The work was too large to get it all in one photograph. So what we're going to conclude with is at the same time, other women contributed to explore figurative and abstract pictorial languages that related more directly to the political goals of the women's movement. And so what we're going to see with the women's movement is women exploring these very large and vast areas of art and challenging assumptions of the art and the art world itself.